if you can sort out your issue on that front. Greetings, everyone. I'm Professor David Wilczitz. I'm a professor at the University of Johannesburg and the director of the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional Public Human Rights and International Law, and also a professor at the University of Reading. And we are delighted to be one of the partners in the seminar exploring the intersection of violence in relation to women and relation to animals. It's a really interesting topic, not often engaged, particularly an issue in the global South. And we also delighted that this is the first part of hopefully a range of seminars around animal rights in the global South. But also importantly, the seminars is linked to, obviously, yesterday in South Africa was Women's Day. It commemorates a nonviolent march in 1956 in South Africa. And it is a very important day in the new South Africa of actually harnessing and allowing us and enabling us to think about issues around gender equality and the advancement of the rights of women. And to that end, we have this, the Institute I direct has 4 seminars this month. We've already had one on the right to abortion. We have this seminar exploring intersections. And we've got next week, we've got a seminar on the 16th dealing with extending delictual liability for the police around gender-based violence. And at the end of the month, we have a seminar on rights of partners in unmarried, heterosexual partners in unmarried relationships, which there's a seminal judgment in South Africa on that more recently. So we look forward to you joining us for those as well. If you are interested, I will pop in the details for who you should contact. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Amy Wilson, who is going to introduce Animal Law Reform South Africa. Over to you, Amy.
Great, thanks so much, David. Good evening or afternoon or morning, everyone. I'm Amy P. Wilson, the Executive Director and one of the founders of Animal Law Reform South Africa. We are SA's first dedicated animal law nonprofit organization. We utilize legal and policy tools to ensure the protection and well-being of humans, non-human animals, as well as the environment. We recognize that animal suffering and exploitation does not only affect animals, but affects people too. Animal issues are fundamentally linked with human issues. We were founded on the principle that justice is enhanced where legal protection is available to all sentient beings, and importantly, that human rights are enriched and not impoverished by including animals in the notion of justice. We are really excited about today's seminar as it helps to draw some of those important linkages between the oppression of humans, particularly women in this instance, and animals. It is essential that we start viewing these matters holistically in order to better understand them and their complexities, as well as to come up with effective strategies and solutions to tackle them. We want to thank all of our fantastic speakers, our moderator, and our wonderful partners for this event, and of course, all of you for joining us. We really hope that you enjoy it, that you learn, and that you feel encouraged and inspired to do your own further research and work. Thanks so much. I'm going to hand over to Alok.
Hi, so I'm Alok, and I'm based out of Goa in India, and I'm also, I represent a very small outfit called the Center for Research on Animal Rights, and I'm co-organizing this panel with Amy and David and Animal Law South Africa, and I'm very excited for it, and I'm really excited. This is a discussion we've been having for a couple of months, and I actually was on a panel last year on uncaging the zoos, where I talked about my work on captive elephants. And actually, the center that I've been thinking about for a while, which is now really out of this little office in my home, in my study, and only has me as an unpaid employee, but I'm sure better things are ahead, is entirely focused on the work I presented last year on captive elephants in India. In fact, one of India's greatest animal lawyers and environment lawyers in the audience today, Norma, and I do a lot of work with Norma and on these issues. And so yes, I think, you know, and I've talked about this a little bit before, last time, but I'll just say that my interest, because of my work in my past life on queer rights, was always in the conflict of culture and rights. And I find unexpectedly on a similar terrain where animal rights in India in particular are constantly have to redefine its, you know, the issue around the issue of the defense of culture, the defensive culture to exploit animals. And it's a particularly difficult conversation in India because the defensive culture to exploit animals is coming from a cultural setting which is essentially or historically has a legacy of being extremely compassionate to animals. So, it's a very tough kind of a battle for us, which is where my work on captive elephants in India, which are used for religious processions in temples, or various male bulls, which are used for traditional races and sports, has become very central to my work. And I'm very interested in this work, and my center currently really focuses on that and wants to continue to do more work on this work. So anyway, that's my very brief introduction, and I will now pass the baton on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alok. We're delighted to partner with you, and it's really wonderful to have a comparative perspective on this panel between South Africa and India and beyond as well, which our speakers will give us. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our chair for this panel is Dr. Makanatsa Makonese. She is an independent consultant with Animal Law Reform South Africa and working on a project on the transformation of South Africa's food system. She holds a PhD in law from the University of Zimbabwe, and her research focuses on women's law, land law, and international human rights law. Her passion lies in using the law, national constitutions, and international human rights frameworks to promote human rights. She's in fact a founder of the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association and is currently the deputy chief of party for the American Bar Association Southern Africa Human Rights Program based in Johannesburg, where her work is focused on a range of themes relating to women's customary land rights and indigenous people's rights. We're delighted to have you chairing this panel. Over to you, Makanatsa.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. We are delighted to have you participating in this very important webinar, which is looking at exploring the intersection of violence against women and animals. And it's being co-hosted by three organizations: the Animal Law Reform South Africa, the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional, Public, Human Rights and International Law at the University of Johannesburg, as well as the Center for Research on Animal Rights in India. The three organizations have already been introduced and a brief description given of the kind of work that they are currently focusing on. We've got three panelists, three very experienced panelists who are going to be taking us through this seminar. These are Dr. Carla Tsampiras, Bharat Ramachandran, as well as Dr. Sheena Swemmer. I'll give brief bios of the panelists at the time of their speaking. But before we go into the presentations by the three speakers, I just want to give a brief introduction or description of the seminar that we are having today. From what we have heard from the 3 or 4 speakers that have spoken already, we realize that there is an increasing recognition of the overlapping and intersecting oppressions between human and non-human animals. In the context of women's rights, this has gained much traction with scholars and activists. We have raised to the surface many important connections between the various perceptions, abuses, and harms against animals and those perpetrated against women. And a variety of common underlying themes, amongst others, being the issue of power, the objectification and use of bodies, as well as harm and physical abuse between non-human and human animals. While there's been notable scholarship in this area, much of the focus has been on the context and issues within the global north, and less attention has been paid to similar issues in the global south, with less research and scholarship, less research and scholarship, as well as potential solutions that are needed in order to curb these challenges. As an example, South Africa in particular has some of the highest rates of gender-based violence and femicide, as well as rape in the world. Research on the link between domestic violence against animals and women has been lacking, and only recently has a PhD study considered this question. In the Indian context, one cannot talk about animal rights without talking about caste, gender, and religion. caste, gender, and religion are fundamentally specious. They create an arbitrary hierarchy within human beings and non-human animals. For example, the notion of purity promoted by casteist thought affects women as much as it does Dalits, tribals, and Muslims, who are treated as impure based on their consumption of meat. The veneration of the cow as mother figure, as with women, coexists with dissonance when it comes to her abuse in dairies. In advocating the rights of non-human animals, one therefore needs to be conscious of these intersections. In addition, if we look at South Africa, for example, the fast food outlets or chains in the country, as well as other international institutions, display sexist advertising, utilizing messages both about the bodies of women and non-human animals being available for consumption in different ways. The gendered nature of the marketing and consumption of meat in South Africa is evident in many forms of media that we see in the country. These are just a few examples of some of the complex intersectional issues which arise in relation to oppression of women and animals. Therefore, this seminar aims to highlight and explore some of the intersections from a global South perspective, as well as present some of the work that may result in legal reform in these perspectives. As already indicated, I think by Professor Bilchett, this seminar is the first of a series which is being organized by the three organizations that are hosting us today. And we hope to see many of you in future segments of these seminars. In terms of the order of presentations, we are going to start with Carla Tsampiras, who is going to be our first presenter. Carla is a senior lecturer in medical and health humanities in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She's a social historian of health, interested in the relationships between narratives and ideas about gender, race, class, sexuality, and health. And in looking at health, she looks at it from both the individual's health as well as planetary health. Her current research work is concerned with ecofeminism, flesh foods, that is meat, gender, power, and violence. She teaches a postgraduate course called The Meat of the Matter, Food, Gender, and Planetary Health, and is a vegan feminist interested in developing multidisciplinary food scholarship from the region. She's a member of the Southern African Historical Society. She sits on the Environmental Humanities South Working Group, is a board member of the Institute for Medical Humanities at Durham, and is a founding member of the Medical and Health Humanities Africa Network. So Carla, can you please take over and give us the first presentation? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everybody. And I think it's always intriguing for me that the moments of efforts to disrupt things, making the use of women's bodies and pornography is something that has been brought to our attention without us even needing to try. At some point, I think we need to have the larger discussions around, the exploitation of different types of bodies for pornographic purposes. But that's perhaps for another day. For today, I want to thank all the organizers, our hosts, our co-presenters, and everybody for being here. And I'd like to speak very briefly about some work I've done that draws on examples of media advertising and marketing from South Africa, from a local kind of national and an international perspective, which I have colleagues in India, as one of the examples from India, may have had first-hand experience of or may recall. I'm going to share my screen, and I have set a timer. So if you hear a weird thing, that was to just keep me on track. So I'm just going to share screen. Please, can people just indicate if they can see that? Yes, great, excellent. No. Okay, so firstly, I wanted to say, I think that, we've just celebrated, does one celebrate Women's Day? We've just had Women's Day in South Africa, and on the news today was the account of a young woman of 13 here in South Africa who was shot accidentally, in the sense that she happened to be in the wrong place in the wrong time and got shot down this morning, or yesterday, actually yesterday afternoon, because of walking through an area where there was gang violence, and her life was taken because she happened to be walking to a shop. Here and elsewhere in the world, those everyday actions, walking to a shop, walking to a post office, getting on a bus, walking into your own home, are often fraught with immense levels of violence. And so I think that exploring the intersections of violence against women and animals, which I'd also like to argue extend to our kind of engagement with the very system that gives us life, so the entire planetary system, are vitally important to discuss at this point, where we see yet again record-breaking heat waves and windstorms and rainstorms and droughts. So yes, if ever there has been a time for us to be having this discussion, now is the time. So this presentation is based on work I did, a piece called Hot Chicks on Board, Gender, Meat and Violence in Food Marketing in and from South Africa. And when I was thinking about the questions that the seminar series looks to explore, I realized some of them I have no capacity to answer or apply any meaningful responses to, but there are two where I think I can give input into. And those are the two that I've highlighted: these ideas of imagery, marketing, and messaging of the meat industry, and how that essentially perpetuates patriarchal values, and the relationship between violence against women and non-human animals. So the talk is going to focus on those, and at the end I'll come back to these central questions and just add a few thoughts. So this work came out of a call for a special edition of Gender Questions that had it as its central term this idea of what are the ordinary indexes of power relations. So not what are the deep theoretical ways in which we understand power relations, or, not what are the kind of very micro-specific or disciplinary specific ways, but what are the ordinary indexes of power relations? When we look around us in the world, when we walk every day in the world, when we drive, cycle, sit down to share food, start an online webinar and have ourselves exposed to pornography, what are those indices of power? How do they shape us? Where do we see them? And so for me, the question then became, what are the ordinary indexes of patriarchal and capitalist power relations, particularly in relations to women's bodies and the bodies of non-human animals? So for those of you who were in South Africa at the time, and for those of you who may have seen this online, in 2019, there was a really quite substantial march in Cape Town against gender-based violence. This happened in September, so, September 2019. And many of the placards were kind of quite clear, rape is a man's issue, don't get raped, and the don't get raped just changed to don't rape. Enough is enough. And the placards and protests and the sharing of grief and anger combined in some ways to form indices of personal power and disempowerment, that women gathered, organized, and named their experiences and also directly challenged state authority, reveals obviously a level of socio-political power. But that women had to do so because of ongoing femicide and shared experiences of surviving rape, GBV, and the everyday sexism that forms part of the spectrum of patriarchal rape culture, reveals the limitations of that power. So Makanatsa, you've already indicated these, but in 2018, 2019, there were 52,420 sexual offences reported in South Africa, of which 41,583 were rapes. But we know that research in South Africa has shown that there is a significant underreporting of rape, and this is a global trend as well. The figures for South Africa are around 1 in 9, only 1 in every 9 cases to 1 in every 25 cases being reported. So we have a context where there is, like, violence is a reality of being, there is no effort or energy to think of everything else. But at the same time as we have this violence against quite, like individuals and communities, there are also levels of violence experience between people and across species boundaries. And that the types and degrees of violence are essentially embedded in physical, emotional, structural, economic, social, historical, and political inequalities and inequities. And we know that they're also mediated by those inequities and inequalities. And what those do is to create sustained discriminatory articulations of gender, race, class, abilities, sexual orientations, and speciesism. So what we see is that the gross financial inequality, as it increases in terms of financial disparity, also harkens and increases and essentially makes worse the other forms of inequalities that we see around us. And those are linked to violence, those are linked to things like food security, those are linked to control over one's physical body, they're linked to the realizations of rights and laws. So if we think about this, what does that mean, particularly in a South African context, and how does that link to politics, and what all does that have to do with food? Well, I would make a case that this inequality is part of something that we could refer to as what the historian Thomas More has called the capitalocene, okay, the age of capital, the age in which the entire historical era has been shaped by endless accumulation of capital. And as More reminds us, capitalism and its driving relations have indeed direct horrific violence towards human and extra-human life. In the paper, I go into more detail, but whether you look at South African leadership from 1652, when the Dutch East India Company came and changed the landscape for food purposes, via Cecil John Rhodes and his use of his political office to facilitate mining and exploitation, through Jacob Zuma, even to our current president, whose, of course, initial holdings included one of the largest holdings in McDonald's, a fast food restaurant, you see a very direct link between political power, the accumulation of capital, and the exploitation of various forms of bodies, both human and non-human. Now, you add to that we face a current context where the natural extension of that pursuit, endless pursuit for capitalism and this idea of endless growth, is the climate crisis, which is becoming more and more real, but we also know will be experienced across geopolitical contexts and also will be gendered, raced, and classed. You know, environmental activists here, from trade unions, from various points, have made this point. If you have enough money, you can try and alleviate the impacts of the climate crisis. If you have huge amounts of money, you may be able to find yourself a sufficiently high island to go and live on. But for the vast majority of people living in the world, the class, race, sex, abilities, and species context in which they find themselves will shape their experiences of the climate crisis. Okay, that's all very fine and well, and it's kind of vaguely interesting, but how does that link to meat and food and examples of those marketing in local areas? So the first example comes from a van that I kept seeing on my campus. And I want to just make the point that I think that there is a clear linkage that many others have made more efficiently than me about the link between systemic ideologies that facilitate violence and exploitation. The examples I want to share from you deal with 3 examples of that made explicit and brought home. The first is from this company called Farm Fresh. It's a medium size business in South Africa. Their trucks all have plays on ideas around chickens or food or so forth on them. But the ones that really annoyed me were these ones. Hot chicks on board. Okay, bearing in mind this is a frozen chicken company. So hot chicks is not referring to pre-cooked food. It's quite clearly a play on the idea of women as chicks, and of course, not only as diminutive, small, you know, byproducts of the sex acts of a rooster and a hen, but as somehow available and accessible and edible. And this one, our breasts are bigger and better. Okay, bigger than, better than what and for whom? So this was a kind of very local example, a very local example of a series of adverts that directly make use of a shorthand, an everyday index in the terms of language, to make a link between the bodies of hens and chickens and the bodies of women. Now, this is only one component part of what this looks like. The everyday experience of having to drive past trucks that, while you're trying to mind your own business and get to and from work in a taxi, in your car, to constantly be reminded that parts of one's body are not only associated with other animals' bodies, but with a perpetual consumption, is part of those everyday indexes of power. Okay, everyday indexes of being told where you are and how you fit in the world. So the chicken is no longer just a piece of flesh, neither is it a sentient being. In the same way, the women referred to by the chicks are no longer independent thinking beings. They are part of larger consumable absent reference. If we move from there to a national example, so that was a kind of regional example, Steers did a series of adverts where they used what was called technology, and in the technology, the idea was that these little green marks that you see on the screen were meant to track where people's eyes were looking, whether they were looking at the very banal, kind of quite mediocre, very vanilla ideas of what is sexually attractive and what types of women are sexually attractive, or whether people were looking at the burger. The article has a very more detailed analysis of this, but the overarching message in this was that both women's bodies and, in this case, the bodies related to cows and bulls were available for consumption and to be eaten. And the advert completely conflated both sexual desire and sexual appetite with physical appetite, okay, with the appetite, the desire to eat a burger in this case. There's also a whole bunch of sub-commentary over this advert that speaks to a very masculinist idea of both sexual identity and sexual veracity and sexual prowess. Now, there's a myriad of things wrong with this just by looking at the pictures. There's more detailed analysis in the articles, but to make the obvious points, clearly this is not targeted at a group of lesbian burger consumers. The male voice over the way in which it was read was to appeal to a very specific idea of a voraciously hungry meat and woman eating man, okay, an everyday index of masculinity played forward in an advert that by its very nature excludes women who are not, who are not participating in this. It excludes men who don't participate in these kinds of ideas of masculinities. It excludes, obviously, the sentient beings who form the flesh food that's being eaten. And just in those images, we see these casual reinforcements of everyday indexes of powers. Okay, the advert, had traction outside of just TV, and people spoke about it. And, there's often, that reinscription, that chick on the wooden horse drool. So those ideas of language and visual representation and marketing and how that is played out beyond the realms and spaces in which they exist. In this context, complaints against the advert didn't really result in much. The Advertising Standards Authority has been through its own ups and downs, and there wasn't any effort or much achieved through the complaints that were made. The international example, and I realize I'm almost very short of time, so I just want to end with this. The international example is Nando's, which in South Africa claims a kind of quite solidly South African identity, but of course is an international corporation that interestingly doesn't actually declare its South African profits, but does declare its other profits. They have a history of doing kind of adverts that are sexist in a variety of ways, and also adverts that are politically quite astute. They ran a campaign in 2016 that included a tagline, "We don't mind if you touch our buns or breasts or even our thighs." The advert appeared in local newspapers in India and included this picture of a kind of splayed chicken with the tagline, "We don't mind if you touch our buns, our breasts, or even our thighs. Whatever you're into, enjoying any Nando's meal with your hands is always recommended." Now, the advert unsurprisingly drew a lot of critique and backlash, and quite a lot of pushback from feminists and groups in India, articulating the clear connection between the idea of touching anything with or without somebody else's permission. And Nando's eventually issued an apology on their Facebook site in India. And they said they promised to do better in the future, and then subsequently have carried on having sexist adverts in other parts of the country. So the point of all of this is, well, how does that relate to our past, present, and our future? On a health front, we know that organizations like Wellcome have funded the Lancet Commission, which has shown the direct impact between excessive meat eating and health, identified health contexts. We know that there is work that needs to be considered in terms of both the occupational hazards that come with working in mass-produced meat production, as well as in the comorbidities that come with excessive meat consumption. We can try and teach these things in our educational spaces. We can try and work with activists who are working towards reimagining what our cultures of food look like in their broadest context. And that brings me back to these questions that we asked initially. What are the things we can do? Well, for me, obviously, these kinds of events are some of the first ways in which we start thinking these through. We bring together the expertise from a variety of areas. I would argue that in addition to a theoretical relationship, we also need greater involvement with historical contexts about how these relationships can be problematized. I think in terms of intersections, we need to develop from intersectionality theory, from queer ecologies, and we need to think about the capitalist scene, inequalities and structural violence and the way that these play out in these spaces. I think we need to think about what it is that we can all bring, our various organizations, our various knowledges and expertise. We can't all be experts in everything, but we can bring together in a kind of moment of epistemic generosity and epistemic curiosity the strengths that we have and the knowledge that we have to tackle these problems from a variety of fora, whether that's via law reform or via addressing health concerns, engaging with what it means to critically think through food and food studies, to the kind of engagement with broader ideas of environmental humanities. In terms of how law can be assisted to tackle violence, there are people here who are way more skilled and capable to give insights to that, and I believe will do so. And so my contribution to that is to just be gratefully part of this and to listen to what is said, and to say that I think that law and the context and relationship of law to social justice speaks to directly the nub of all of this, that if we follow through the ideas of social justice, we follow through and we start unraveling the overarching webs of oppression that we see linked through all these spaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsampiras. I think what I've picked from your presentation is the issue that the violence that is experienced by both human and non-human animals is centered on various forms and levels of inequality and power imbalances. And I think the most important thing, as you've said, is to ensure that we have continuous research as well as interactions from a variety of areas. And this helps in bringing together our various expertise to tackle the challenges from a variety of fora. And I hope this meeting, as you said, is one of the first events or activities or focus areas that is going to lead into more work to ensure that the issues that we are discussing today are addressed by as many of us as are possible. Our next presentation is going to be by Bharat Ramachandran. Bharat is currently has the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations as its Chief Executive Officer. She has brought 3 decades of her experience working as a journalist, writer, and consultant with civil society movements to her work with FIAPO, which is India's leading animal rights advocacy body. So Bharat, can you please give us your presentation?
Thank you, Makanatsa. Really appreciate it. Thank you for that fantastic presentation, Carla. In fact, I have actually seen advertisements like that walking around on the roads around my home, you know, and every time it is an assault almost. And today I'm extremely grateful to be here, and I look forward to learning a lot from everyone. And what I'm going to be talking about is, in the Indian context, we feel that we need to look at animal rights in the light of other overlapping intersections. So it's that question in that list of questions that was there. I'm going to be looking at overlapping intersections with caste, with gender, as well as with religion. And I'm taking the case of the dairy cow, because India, and how the rights of the dairy cow intersect with the rights of those communities that are othered on the basis of their caste, gender, and religion. So I remember this very clear incident in July of 2016, where there were piles and piles of carcasses of bovines that lay rotting on the roads of Gujarat, which is a western state in India, after a massive protest and strike by the Dalit community that is traditionally tasked with the removal and disposal of animal carcasses. And I remember this particular tweet from that period where carcasses of cows were being thrown outside government offices in Gujarat. And one particular tweet said, "If she is your mother, then you do her last rites." And that really struck me. And why was this happening? On 11th July 2016, 4 young men who were caught skinning a dead cow and another older person were tied to a car and beaten with a metal rod for more than 5 hours by a group of self-appointed cow protection vigilantes in Gujarat's Una. The victims were members of the Chamar caste, part of India's Dalit community that has traditionally been tasked with disposal of animal carcasses by using their skin, bones, and other body parts for commercial purposes. This particular incident to me exposes the hypocrisy of India's treatment of the cow, as well as its treatment of marginalized communities like the Dalits. I don't have a presentation, but if you, you could just imagine this, that India is the largest milk producing country in the world. So the dairy industry in India is really the leading dairy industry in the world. India is also the largest beef producing and exporting country in the world, whereas most of it is buffalo meat, though we don't have an industry where cattle are raised for meat. Dr. Yamini Narayanan, in her essay, points out how Article 48 of the Indian Constitution simultaneously provides for the growth of the dairy sector in India while banning the slaughter of the cow. Because of this ban, the ban on cow slaughter, the entire industry around the slaughter of the cow and the industries around beef and leather have been forced to be driven underground, but they have the tacit cooperation of all concerned, including the law enforcement. Who are the people who handle the cow, the dead cow? Those who handle the dead cow are from the minority communities and most marginalized communities, Dalits and Muslims predominantly. Slaughterhouse workers, even in government-sanctioned slaughterhouses, typically come from these communities. These are livelihoods we need to understand that are assigned by caste. To give an example, other forms of labor that Dalit communities are expected to perform is clearing of human waste, often by hand, and the cremation of human bodies. Much of my work in the last 20 years has been with Dalit and Adivasi communities. And one of the earliest books which documented the hidden discrimination against Dalits, called Broken People, points out how during the Marama festival in Karnataka, the state that I live in, upper castes force Dalits to slaughter buffaloes and drink their blood. Such forced consignment of Dalit communities to jobs and supposedly traditional cultural practices is meant to keep intact this othering of the Dalit as unclean and therefore untouchable. Workers who handle the dead cow live in perpetual fear and a very real threat to their lives from the armies of self-styled cow vigilantes across the country. And the motivation behind the cow vigilantes is the veneration of the cow as Mata, which in Hindi and other Indian languages means mother. So in today's India, the cow is very much a symbol of Hindutva nationalism. Communities that consume beef or that do the work in the slaughter and leather industries, such as Muslims and Dalits, are vilified and are seen as dirty or unclean because they slaughter the mother. The notion of purity, which is promoted by Caste's thought, affects women because even with women, their honor, which is seen, honor is linked to purity. So this notion of purity, which affects women, it affects Dalits, tribals, and Muslims too, who are treated as impure because they handle meat, because they consume meat. And even among these communities, women are the worst victims. So I remember talking to a woman who told me, we are considered untouchable and unclean, but not when it comes to rape. So this is the kind of treatment that is meted out to people who work in these industries. And yet the dairy industry, which is the source of the animals that finally end up in slaughter and leather industries, the dairy industry whitewashes itself in a holiness that is sanctioned both by religion and by caste. Milk is seen as an inherent part of most upper caste rituals and religious ceremonies. The deification of the cow in India sits very comfortably along and even sanctions the use of the cow or the abuse of the cow for milk, while turning a complete blind eye to the fate that awaits the cow once she is spent. In all of this politics of milk, the plight of the dairy cow who is serially impregnated, milked, and once spent, disposed of as a resource for slaughter is made invisible. I think it's the phrase would be is made invisible, because I think there is this dissonance between that simultaneously you venerate the cow and you cannot see the suffering of the dairy cow. The Dalit rights movement is only now beginning to recognize that the roots of the community's oppression and the roots of the abuse of non-human animals are not very different. They both arise from speciesism, the accordance of moral superiority to a caste, a people, or a species of non-human animal. And I think increasingly, this is becoming part of the mainstream discourse. And it wasn't there a few years ago. If now we look at, apart from the Dalit rights movements, if we look at the feminist movements in India, if milk is the product of the exploitation of the reproductive capacity of a female body, then it doesn't take us very long to recognize that bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom of both humans as well as non-human animals like the cow are taken away by patriarchy, capitalism, and other forms of systemic oppression. So this recognition is really at the heart of the phrase "MooToo," which was made famous by Peter Lavenheim in LA Times. And he wrote about this right at the peak of the Me Too movement, and saying that the intention was not to reduce Me Too in any way, but to also add to that and to build solidarity for the oppression of the dairy cow and of farmed animals in general. FIAPO, the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations, where I work, we conducted an investigation into 451 dairy farms across 10 states in India. And we found very, very similar details in all farms, things that were common across farms. One, calves were separated from their mothers immediately after birth. The male calves were either sold to the meat industry or left to die. All farms practiced artificial insemination, which is really a violent act of sexual abomination that is performed upon the cow. Half the farms used that we surveyed used oxytocin twice a day to boost lactation, which, as we know, causes pains very similar to labor pains in the cow. And probably the most chilling of them all was the finding of something called the Kalbacher, which is when a calf dies, a male calf that is left to die, the farmer stuffs the male calf's body with hay and props the baby up as though to tell the mother that the baby is still alive, because it is known that many cows stop lactating when their calf dies. So the idea is to give the mother the sense that the baby is still alive. And some of the videos that I've watched are, they are so heart-rending, of the mother licking the Kalbacher and continuing to lactate. So in all of these, I think the conclusion that we can really come to is that the violence against the dairy cow is very much gendered violence, and it is not recognized as such. So Alok here has written very, very powerfully about sexual crimes against animals, and he writes about Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, and which till recently criminalized unnatural sex between men, including sex with animals. And one of the things that he talks about is that while homosexuality was decriminalized, the part of the Section 377 that pertained to bestiality was retained. So in farmed animals, the violence that is done to them as a matter of course every day is not recognized as gendered violence. When it comes to sexual crimes against animals, they come under the term bestiality, a term that really deserves to be retired for good, as it clothes the non-human animal victim of the crime in a garb of perversion, and the perpetrator of the crime, the person who's committed the sexual act of violence, is being seen as having indulged in bestiality, and despite being the perpetrator, becomes endowed with the qualities of savagery, supposedly of the beast, who is the victim. So the language that is used to denote sexual crimes against animals is also one that further victimizes the victim. So Alok shows how all inquiry into sexual crime against animals is loaded with references to the perpetrator's religion, caste, social demographic, trying to find reasons for this alleged perversion or kink. So this whole framework of bestiality that governs inquiry into sexual crimes against animals is so focused on the perpetrator's kink that it completely dismisses the non-human animal victim's right even to be recognized as a victim. So I was reading this essay by Justin Butler of the vegan movement, and they write about this film called A Time to Kill. And I was sort of applying that frame to this situation. Imagine what it would be like if the victim was cis female, and if the inquiry into her sexual assault rested on identifying the perversion or kink that led to the assault, and not on securing justice for the victim. We would all be uniformly outraged. But in the case of trans people and non-human animals, that's where we are. So, but at the same time, why do animal rights activists resort to filing complaints against Section 377 in cases of sexual assault? Because the alternative is inadequate. I'm not a lawyer, and there are lawyers here, Alok and Norma, who are far, far more qualified. But under Indian law,
can I interrupt you?
Yes.
I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to please wind up the presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. So under Indian law, a perpetrator can get away with a fine of 50 rupees, which is about 75 cents. So there needs to be recognition that victims of sexual assault, irrespective of gender and species, are equally victims of sexual assault. This recognition needs to foster solidarities between feminist, queer, and animal rights movements. So when we look at working on animal rights issues, especially we run a vegan campaign, and we need to be very careful about the language that we use. If we use language that vilifies the slaughterhouse worker, we play right into the caste framework. If we use language that is one that evokes disgust for meat, we walk right into the purity trap. So new solidarities really need to emerge. As animal rights workers, we cannot work in silos and be blind to minority, Dalit, Adivasi, queer, or women's rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat, for that very interesting presentation. And apologies for interrupting the presentation. I'm sure I still had a lot more to present to us, but unfortunately, because of time, I had to interrupt.
Perfectly all right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What I've picked from your presentation, first of all, is the issue of the disproportionate violence or ill treatment that is experienced by minority groups in India, and how it correlates with the violence that is experienced by animals in the country, especially considering that they both fall within the group of vulnerable or marginalized species within the country. I think I also picked the issue of how to use language correctly to ensure that we, through the use of language, provide equal protection to both human and non-human animals, especially when it comes to sexual offenses against both human and non-human animals. And I think that's a very interesting area of analysis when we are discussing the issue of the intersections that are experienced in terms of violence against women, as well as violence against non-human animals. Thank you very much for that. Before we go to the next presentation, I just want to advise everyone to please put your questions, if any, in the chat, so that at the end we'll have an opportunity to look at those questions and probably have answers from the presenters. The next presentation that we are going to have is going to be from Dr. Sheena Swemmer. She is the head of the Gender Justice Program at the Center for Applied Legal Studies, also called CALS. CALS is a public interest law clinic based at the University of the Witwatersrand, which focuses on the realization of the rights in the Constitution through research, advocacy, as well as strategic litigation. She's an admitted attorney and litigates in the field of gender and violence. Dr. Sheena recently completed a PhD in human rights under the title An Ubuntu Feminist Approach to the Inclusion of Companion Animals in South African Domestic Violence Law, which looks at the intersection of violence in the home and potential developments that can take place in South African domestic violence law to protect women, children, and companion animals. Over to you, Dr. Swemmer. I can't hear you. I think there's a problem with your audio.
Can you hear me? Am I on now?
Yes.
Okay, let me just I had to get some technical help, so I went off quickly. Thank you so much for having me. As I was saying, although I was on mute, it's really fantastic to hear the other panelists and hear how much of our research and our work really does intersect with each other. Today I'm going to speak about my PhD work, which is violence in the home, and focusing on the intersection of abuse against women and companion animals. So I want to set my presentation in, or place it in a context of specifically the South African society, which has been said is a hyper-violent society, but also a society with incredibly high rates of gender-based violence, particularly. I do, however, want to acknowledge, as the other panelists have, that there are intersections of violence intersections of violence which involves humans and animals in other areas. And as has been said, previously said, it's in instances of things like abattoir workers, live animal export workers, animal auction workers. So it's really important for us to consider the different ways that interpersonal violence can also intersect with the types of jobs individuals have, and experiencing violence against animals and enacting violence in the home. So to sketch the South African problem is to really look at the rates of interpersonal violence, or as we often say, domestic violence in South Africa. So during the height of COVID, the South African president, which is President Ramaphosa, he said that gender-based violence, and specifically intimate partner violence, was the second pandemic in the country. And this is with studies after the heavy lockdowns showing that families that were already experiencing some forms of violence experience more persistent and sometimes increasing degrees of violence in the home during the hard lockdown. And for those of you who aren't in South Africa, the hard lockdown was really the period where we weren't allowed to leave our homes unless we were going for medical treatment or to the shops to get food. So it was families in homes together all the time. And then in an Amnesty International study around our first week of lockdown, our hard lockdown, it was found that SAPS, which is the South African Police Service, received 2,300 calls in relation to gender-based violence. So we're looking at gender-based violence, which is violence in the home by your family members. And by mid-June 2020, 21 women and children had been killed by their intimate partners or family members. So this really sketches out that South Africa has an incredibly high rate of violence against women, but specifically a rate of high violence in the context of violence in the home by their intimate partners. Now, violence against companion animals, and I just need to pause here to say, for those of you who don't or don't recognize this, companion animals are often also referred to as pets. So I use the term companion animals just because it doesn't have the history of pets as more of an anthropocentric term. But nonetheless, it's very difficult to trace the numbers of violence against animals in general in South Africa. And that, I think, is because there's no real legislative or regulations around having to report those to Parliament, as we have with SAPS as our rape numbers, as well as interpersonal violence numbers, our domestic protection order numbers. So what we can get around the rates of violence against animals is really by looking at the various branches of the NSPCAs around the country. And at least in one province, which is the Cape Town, there's the Cape of Good Hope branch. And in 2019-2020, there were 158 cases of companion animals removed from the cycle of violence. So they specifically used the term cycle of violence, which allows us to know that this was specifically an incident of in-the-home violence. And this is because this refers to something that was found in feminist literature, that there is that in cases of the violation of women by the intimate partner, there is often the heightened or increasing rate of violence, which is then followed by apologies by the man and something called loving contrition, where the woman may feel that she wants to or has to forgive him, and then the violence continues and continues. Although there are other aspects, such as women not being able to leave abusive men because of economic status, because of there's the lack of shelters in South Africa, but that's really what they were speaking about. So we know at least there's the existence of some numbers. Then we also have the issue around our prosecution and convictions, which is generally a problem in South Africa with many violent crimes such as rape. So here, with regards to animals in general, you see that the Cape of Good Hope had 26,880 reports of abuse or neglect, 6,490 investigations into these abuse or neglect cases, 33 criminal cases kicked off, and only 2 convictions, which is a conviction rate of 6%. That's very similar to our conviction rate for rape in our country, which is about 7%. So you can see the intersections again of violence against women and violence against animals. So violence with regards to women and animals in the home has come to be known as something called the link. And that's really talking about the intersection of how these two things happen at the same time within this environment. And in a study by Asione, it was found that of women interviewed in a domestic violence shelter, that 74% of those women had a companion animal 12 months before coming into the shelter. Of those women who had companion animals, 71% of those women reported that their intimate partner had threatened violence or committed violence against the companion animal during that time. So here we start to see how the link really works of how both the woman and the companion animals are victims of violence in the home. As part of a project exploring the co-occurrence of animal maltreatment and intimate partner violence in Canada, it was found that of 116 shelter staff members surveyed, 74% reported that they were aware of women who were abused and who had not come to the shelter because they could not bring their companion animals. So this is also very common with cases of, although shelters do provide for children, many shelters don't provide for boy children over the age of 12. So you see women choosing to stay in violent situations because they can't take those that they love with them. And these are issues that need to be addressed in the future. Also interestingly is that victims can become perpetrators of violence. So in studies, it has been found that both women and children who have been the victims of violence may in fact violate companion animals, and in the instance of women, both companion animals and their children. And in a study by ARCO, it was found that in 2 instances, women who had been victims of domestic violence admitted to hurting or killing their own companion animal, and that women who have experienced violence in the form of intimate partner violence admit that they direct their anger against their children or against a companion animal in the home. And then in a study by Frederick, it was noted in a sample of children between the age of 2 and 12 that had been victims of sexual violence, 35% of boys and 27% of girls were reported to be cruel to animals. So we really see how these other cycles of violence lead victims to become perpetrators, children to become perpetrators, women to become perpetrators of violence. It really is a cycle that is difficult to break out of. Then I want to look at violence against animals as a risk factor. And you will often hear this. Many people will say they'll read about or watch on crime channels about serial killers who violated animals when they were younger. So in an interview with an FBI special agent in the 1970s, it was revealed that when he interviewed 36 multiple murderers in prison, 36% described the killing and torturing of animals when they were younger children, and 46% admitted to doing this when they were adolescents. And importantly, and very astutely in this interview, the agents who had done this research said the following: animal cruelty is as serious as killing human beings. This is not harmless venting of emotion in a healthy individual. This is a warning sign that this individual is not mentally healthy and needs some sort of intervention. Abusing animals does not dissipate those violent emotions. Instead, it may fuel them. So we see how the abuse of animals can lead to the abuse of humans, but that's not the only reason we need to intervene. We need to intervene because of the animals' value in and of themselves, but we can see how these things can be predictors of future violence or violence against other victims. Now to look specifically at South African law. The South African Domestic Violence Act is the main act that deals with intimate partner violence in the home. And currently, the South African Domestic Violence Act doesn't include animals in any form whatsoever. There is the possibility of including animals as property, but for obvious reasons, and I know I'm speaking to the converted or to the choir, we don't want to be regarding animals as property. So instead of arguing that they could be damaged property and you have to stop someone from damaging property, we really need to work towards acknowledging animals in and of their own for protection. So at this point, we have no protection whatsoever for animals, and no recognition that there is an intersection of violence in the home where animals are also being abused, as well as women and children. If we turn to the act that does aim to protect animals, that's the Animals Protection Act. And this is a really old act and actually hasn't moved along with the times and with the knowledge systems around animals and animal rights. It doesn't deal with specifically violence against animal in the forms of violence in the home and in an intersectional way. It also doesn't have the crimes don't, or the payment of the time doesn't match the crime, so to speak. And you can have sentences being as low as 4,000 Rand, which are not sentences, fines for the violation of an animal. So it's really, we have these pieces of legislation that don't speak to each other, but also don't really represent what is happening in the country and around the world with the intersection of violence in the home. So to finish off, I propose the development of our laws. So the inclusion of companion animals in their own right in the Domestic Violence Act. This is where animals could be complainants, very similar to children, which we have, that allows another person to act on behalf of a child to bring a protection order. These could be also interested organizations such as the NSPCA bringing a protection order on behalf of an animal, or a woman bringing a protection order on behalf of herself and her companion animal. Then I suggest that there's the development of interdepartmental policies. This is where our NSPCA speaks to our Department of Social Development, which is our primary department dealing with children, and also speaks to, and also women in cases of violence against women. These have cross-reporting mechanisms. So when an NSPCA investigator goes to a home and sees that the companion animal has been violated and has been a victim of violence, we can ask questions about the women and the children in that home too, and vice versa. And then I would like to see a similar obligation that we have with regards to reporting in cases of child abuse. So South Africa has mandatory reporting mechanisms with regards to neglect and sexual violence against children. And this makes it that certain professions have obligations to report violence against children, and failure to do so is a crime in our country. And I think we could have very similar reporting mechanisms, not so maybe perhaps to make it less or an easier to palatable approach is to at least have certain professions, like with children, have obligations with regards to animals. So some other jurisdictions in the world have certain reporting mechanisms that are mandatory for veterinarians. So we should really see that type of intervention explored. And finally, we really need the Animal Protection Act to be amended to replicate something similar to the South African Children's Act. The South African Children's Act deals with everything that has children's interests. So it deals with neglect and abuse, but also deals with things like if children need to be separated from their parents, what are the state's obligations with that regard? There's a children's court that is set up in terms of the act. I think we need an act that establishes an animal court. So we really need both the development, and I see my time there, the development of our laws around domestic violence and animals, but we also need them talking to each other so that everyone in the home can be protected, both or all three, women, children, and animals. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sheena, for that interesting presentation as well. The statistics on conviction rates for violence against animals as well as rape. You gave a statistic of a conviction of 6% for violence against animals, as well as 7% for conviction rates when it comes to rape cases in the country. I think that's a very telling kind of statistic in terms of the indication of lack of commitment, I think, by the authorities when it comes to addressing both issues, which are really serious issues in the country in South Africa. And I think that's an area of more research as well as advocacy efforts to make sure that those issues are adequately addressed. And your proposal on having an all-encompassing or holistic protection mechanism for all those experiencing violence in the home, be it women, children, and animals, and ensuring that the various institutions in the country that are working on both the protection of non-human animals as well as human animals are able to work together to address this violence and the various forms of violence that the human animals as well as non-human animals face in the country is actually very important. Thank you very much for that presentation. And once again, thank you to all the three presenters for the day. We have got a few minutes left, about 15 or so minutes before we enter the session. And I would like us to just take in a few questions if there are any. From the chat, I see most of the issues that are being raised are suggestions, as well as ideas on how we can address some of these challenges. I don't know if in addition to this, Amy, if you can pick anything on which the presenters can respond, please let me know, as I'm not able to pick any questions from the chat. Amy Wilson.
Yes, thanks so much, Makanatsa. I think maybe if the speakers could talk to some of the points that have been raised in the chat about how we could potentially work together better, both as human rights activists as well as animal rights activists, maybe some of the intersections. How do we do a better job than we have been doing? And I know you've touched on some of these, but I think from a practical perspective, a lot of people would like to know what they can do. So maybe if you have any suggestions, that could be helpful.
Yes, maybe we can start with Carla and then in the order of the presentations, then Bharati and Sheena.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think this is the key challenge for pretty much every intersectional kind of issue that we face, whether it's land rights or the environmental crisis, or is how do we, because we've for so long spent time working in kind of quite narrow or very specific silos. And on one hand, that's an issue of practicality. Like everybody can't do everything, and also there's only so much time in the day, and so many hours, and people have multiple responsibilities. I mean, I think one of my key responses would be there needs to be one central thing that people can speak about. Like, so one idea, one thing that holds people. And if you have a shared thing, I think working out the details around that can be easier. So, I mean, as an example, with the medical health humanities, when COVID hit, we were trying to think about, okay, so how do we speak about, we'd had this plan for a thing about breath. But we wanted people to think about breath beyond the kind of everyday ideas of breath only as a health concern linked to asthma or respiratory illnesses. And then COVID came, and so breath suddenly took on a whole new dimension. And so then it suddenly people start thinking about things in a different way. So, I mean, what strikes me here is that what links a lot of people who are interested in things like human rights activism, NGOs, is a notion at some point of care. It's care for each other, care for the common good, care for society, care for, you know, other people in society. So if we started with something like a central notion and then brought people together and say, okay, so how would you extend your idea of care? Then that might open up conversations between why care can be extended. And the point, I mean, my co-presenters have made that, you know, extending care doesn't diminish the care of one. It doesn't, and it never needs to diminish. There doesn't need to be less care in the world if you're focusing on one thing. You can have more care by bringing more types of care into discussion with each other. So, I mean, some of what I think that looks like is that we have to like actively go outside our comfort zones and take part in conversations that we wouldn't usually be in. So, I mean, I have to say I felt a little intimidated coming into like a space that I only did 1 year of law and I was really bad at it. So I was like, oh, okay, but I have other things that I can bring. And then I realized that, you know, the way my colleagues speak, there's this wealth of knowledge. So how we do it, I think we have to actively make the spaces for the conversations. Now, the question is if that's the most pressing thing, because that also becomes the question is where do we focus time and energy? So, I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer to this, and I know I'm not providing one. They may necessarily answer your question particularly, but I think it's about creating space and finding one common thing that people are all interested in, and then having the discussion around that. Because that means you're not starting from a point of like a moral judgment of like, oh, you don't care about this, therefore you are. The question is, what do you care about, and how do you extend, or what are you interested in? How do you extend that? So yeah, that's the best I have at this point, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Bharat.
Thank you, Carla. I think I've picked up on one word, which is conversations from what you said. There needs to be much more space for these conversations with different groups. And like you also mentioned, we sadly work under immense pressures already of resources, people, talent, time, and to be able to make the space for these conversations is really a tough one. And, so a lot of my background has also been in fundraising. So I really believe that there's a lot of donor education that needs to happen around this area. And unless donors really step up, and for example, even after COVID has devastated the whole globe across, we're still sort of serving meat at COP26 and really not willing to talk about animal agriculture. So unless we can all take small steps and have small conversations, but I think the big donors, there has to be some form of education. There has to be funding available for organizations, for research, to be able to actively have these conversations and make space for this. Someone told me a long time ago, if you budget it, it gets done. So I really think from a very practical point of view, that is something that would help create this space.
Yes, Sheena.
Thanks. So I just see a question here in the comments just about the countries that I had done comparative work looking around. It was Arkansas in the US, and it was Victoria in Australia. if you do want to look it up. I think something, and I agree with the compassion and care. I do think something that holds things together from my view, because I work in gender violence predominantly, is violence, and how violence does intersect, and it doesn't matter that it's not about prioritizing one, it's about prioritizing all will filter down to protection of all and protection of one. And I think we're starting to see that with the environmental kind of discourse of slow violence, which is the environmental violence that people are experiencing. So I think that they are opposites of each other, is the care and the violence is. I do really believe those are the strongest kinds of motifs that we have here, is violence is being played out, and the alternative is the care. And I think specifically in South Africa, where we have principles like Ubuntu, it is about care. It is about caring for everyone, benefits us all and benefits the individual.
Thank you, Sheena. Carla, may I request you to answer this question? It's from Anita Dick. She says, I'm Peruvian and we eat guinea pigs. Is that animal violence?
Thanks, Anita. Thank you for asking the question and for being bold, and brave to ask it in this context. The journeys that we all take towards understanding our relationship with our foods and where our foods come from are often very personal, and are ones that we need to take at specific places and spaces. All food to a degree, especially if it's part of a mass globalized industrial system, requires violence, whether it's monocropping of a certain type of thing, or insecticides going onto plants or antibiotics into animals, or the system of food, the global food system that we have, is inherently violent. It mistreats the land, the soil, the air. It mistreats many of the people who are responsible for picking and collecting and harvesting and transporting food. It hits people in the pockets when they're trying, the food inflation that we've seen since COVID in various parts of the world. These things all have an aspect of different types of violence, structural, micro, at almost every level. In terms of eating guinea pigs, I live on a continent where pretty much most things that move are eaten. I made a decision for myself around what I was comfortable doing and whether I was willing to kind of outsource violence. And let me just say, I come from a family where like hunting and fishing was kind of like shit we did. Okay, there were things on spits and there were all sorts of stuff being eaten. So I never had the kind of chance of being having my food choices made outside of that context in some ways. So I can speak for myself and what I feel and what I was willing to allow people to do. For a long time, there were things I was like, well, it's fine, it controls populations of animals. Like I had a whole bunch of theories that justified what I ate and why I ate it. And then I got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. Like I couldn't argue for myself. So I can't answer if that's animal violence for the whole of Peru. I don't know the context of people's food security. I don't know the context of people's availability and access to other food. And I certainly have no authority to be speaking on how and people are trying to survive. What I can say is that it's a good question to ask, and it's a question to start and for you to make a decision on, and for you to think about what constitutes animal violence for you, and then maybe to read around how other people have written about that to see where that takes you. Okay, so yeah, I mean, for me, I try to be as conscious as possible about the food that I do eat and grateful to the plants and the system and the soil that provides me with nutrition. But I'm also immensely fortunate in that I don't go to bed hungry. I have capacity to have food on my plate pretty much every day. In fact, every day, and more than once a day. So those are the capacities I'm able and the decisions I'm able to make because of my particular context. As somebody who is anti-speciesist, I don't think we have some inane or ordained right to be able to exploit other people, other species, other minerals, other anything for our own use. But again, that's where I am at. And I don't know your context. I don't know what your situation is. So I applaud you for asking the question. I think pursue the question until you find an answer that makes sense for you.
Thanks, Carla. And I think the issue of one's consciousness when it comes to their relationship with non-human animals is a very important starting point when it comes to discussions of this nature. There is a question from Deborah. She thanks all three of you for the very good presentations. And your question is that, do you have any thoughts on modifying or increasing penalties for criminal activities against women and animals? This she asks because the enforcement of the laws seems to be universally weak. Maybe Bharat and Sheena, you can each answer in just one minute.
Okay, it will take much less than 1 minute because this is really not my area of expertise, but we have really been in India looking at the amendment of the Prevention of Cruelty Against Animals Act, and the offenders right now get away, like I said, paying rupees 10 and 50 and 100 for repeat offenders. And that certainly needs to change. And really the definition of cruelty also needs to change. So that is really what all of us are working towards right now. Sheena.
With regard to South Africa, so our criminal penalties for violence against women are being increased by governments and parliament at the moment. I think the place is that the Animals Protection Act is still really pathetic. So I do think that needs to be addressed. But the real issue for us is that we have such a low rate of prosecution. So whether it was going to be have higher penalties, we still don't have a good enough rate of prosecution. So not enough people are actually being prosecuted for the crimes. So it almost makes these things meaningless in a lot of ways.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll add just a few 3 to 5 minutes to just finish the questions that are in the chat. The next question says a lot of the research quoted on the link is from the US and Canada. And this is the aspect that is used here in South Africa, especially to debunk the relevance of this here in South Africa. So how much actual research is being done, such as fieldwork, interviews, etc., like the interviews of the 1970s? Carla, can you answer this one for us, please?
Okay, was that to me? Sorry, I didn't hear the end thing. Or was it?
Yes, I directed
okay.
Yeah,
so I was actually so Laura, thank you very much. I was actually busy typing your comment because I was worried we'd run out of time. So I'll try and do my comment in a verbal form. So firstly, I think has been said a couple of times now, and what is absolutely vital is that we completely and utterly need specific area, region, continental research work done from the Global South, by the Global South, in however broadly you want to content that. Part of the problem, particularly in academic publishing realms, is that money funding research, postgrads, doctoral students, money for that thing is not as evenly distributed globally, neither is publication. So if you have a look at the kind of the powerhouses of where academic publishing, for example, comes from, quite a few countries, there's a relatively small number of countries who produce a vast amount of work, which means that when you so even, if anybody just Google Scholars something, and there's a whole kind of other issue around the digital divide and digital hierarchies, which we don't have time for, but certain types of research are privileged. And so one of the key things we need to do is to absolutely work out, get our own information, get our own stuff. I'm not sure exactly which research specifically you're talking about. I'm aware of certain comparative work. So there has been some comparative work done in psychology around, for example, the effects of working in a slaughterhouse on slaughterhouse workers, and how how the kind of levels of violence are related in those contexts. There's been some work on Oh, sorry. Okay, so it's the FBI research, Sheena. I mean, okay, so I'll stop my comment then and give Sheena have space for that. So thank you. It is a key question more broadly about where and how our research is done, but it is a key question.
Yes, I think the last question and the last response both give us a good a place to end this discussion. In particular, the fact that there is a lot of research that still needs to be done, especially in the Global South, in order for us to have concrete information, evidence, research-based information that we can all rally around in order for this conversation or these conversations to continue. I would like to thank our three presenters, Sheena, Carla, and Bharat, for very enlightening presentations, which I'm sure many of us have benefited from, and that this will help us as we take the conversations further. May I hand over, maybe before I hand over to Amy, just to thank all the participants as well. I think this was a very lively discussion. So we had a lot of questions on which we could take up the discussions after the presentation. And thank you very much for that. I will hand over to Amy Wilson to close the meeting for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I also just want to say from our perspective as our partners, and very grateful to you for attending. Thank you for your time and efforts. And of course, if you have any questions or you'd like to reach out to us, you can reach us on animallawreform.org or on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. So I'm not sure if David or Alok has any closing thoughts, but thank you so much for all of you to coming.
Great, thank you. Just from our side also, thank you very much, and an enlightening discussion, and thanks to our presenters and to Makanatsa for sharing so ably, and yeah, look forward to having you at some of our other seminars later this month on other issues. Thank you, and we hope also at the animal rights series in the Global South, we also look forward to other discussions. Thank you, and
thank you everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Getting lovely messages here as well for all the presenters. So thank you everyone.
Thank you so much. That was so much fun. And yeah, so many amazing things to hear and learn about. So thank you so much. Thank you for putting it together and bringing us together. And Makanatsa for just like doing that smooth flow between all of us. Really lovely. Thank you, David. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.